this is Catherine Moore, and you are listening to Exposing a Monster podcast. I took probably a week off to spend time with my husband, and I wanted to talk about some of the reasons why it was so easy for my father, John Dowden, who was a United Methodist minister employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration. I wanted to talk about why it was so easy for him to get away with being inappropriate and get away with touching anyone inappropriately right in front of a room full of people. My father, John Dowden, was very cunning and very manipulative. He knew how to work a crowded room. He knew how to move an audience when it came to public speaking. Being a woman, you are vulnerable to a lot of sexual harassment and inappropriate advances by men. And there are men who are so cunning and experienced and skilled in making inappropriate advances, and you don't realize that that is what has happened till it has already happened. This is how my father, John Dowden, was able to get away with touching anyone, an adult or child, or even his own daughter, myself, inappropriately in front of other people. And this is a part of the reason why I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't explain to anyone as a child what was wrong. I just knew I wanted my father to keep his fucking hands off of me, and he wouldn't. I was his property. And anytime I said anything, my mother justified it. But she knew. And it took me a long time to realize that my mother knew what my father was doing and what he had done to me in the past. I have spent decades. I've spent decades working on myself, even before I got married. There were times when I could not afford a therapist, and my way of coping and working on how I had been affected by abuse was by reading books, and one of my favorite authors was Melody Beattie. Melody Beattie is also famous. The most well-known book she's famous for is Codependent No More. But there were other books she has written that I read that were life-changing for me. I have also worked on recovery for an eating disorder. And one of the way the abuse affected my thinking is that from a very early age, I thought that I was ugly. And it started probably as early as first grade. I thought that there was something wrong with me, and by the time I was in the second grade, there had not been any time to heal or recover from the trauma because I had no way of processing or recognizing that I had been through abuse and trauma. There were people when we lived in Groom, Texas, who suspected something was wrong. I spoke with someone when I was around the time that I turned 40. It was a lady that took care of me in Groom, Texas at times, Miss Ruth Hart, and she told me that they had suspected something was wrong, which led me to the conclusion that my parents stopped drugging me with the codeine because people were probably asking questions, and my parents had already been confronted by medical staff at a hospital in Amarillo suspecting that I had been sexually abused, and my parents denied it. Because of that trauma, I thought that there was something wrong with me. I thought that I was ugly. And by the time I was in the 2nd grade, I began to put on weight. By the time I was in the 3rd grade, I was 80 pounds and I was overweight for my age. And because my mother had body shamed me during that time for beginning puberty, I hated my body and I hated myself even more. I had long hair, I had a severe overbite, and the kids would call me Bucktooth Kay. It's still hard to this day to look at photos of when I was a child. I never saw a child that was cute or adorable when I looked at my photos. And when I looked at my photos, I was so convinced, because of what I saw when I looked at myself, that I automatically assumed and I believed that everyone saw exactly what I saw. And my mother was very good at gaslighting and dehumanizing me with other people, wanting desperately for other people to believe that there was something wrong with me, because my mother, Grace Dowden, and my father, John Chester Dowden, didn't want anybody to look at them. When you are growing up as a preacher's kid in the United Methodist Church, the church usually provides a home, and that home is owned by the church. And that is called a parsonage. And I spent a lot of my childhood growing up in homes that were owned by United Methodist churches. And my parents did not have to go through what most people go through. They didn't pay rent. They had bought a home and they sold it, but if times were hard financially, there was always someone there to bail them out and help them out. And the negative view that I had of myself continued all the way into adulthood. I have accepted it now, and what I mean by that is that I understand that my view of myself back then and even today is going to be distorted. And that is just the way that it is. I have accepted and I understand now. I have enough healing and recovery to understand that not everybody is going to see me in the same way that I see myself. And at this point, I really don't care anymore. When I had my sons, that was a healing moment for me. Because my first son, after I had my C-section, he had my face. And my way of making sense out of that was that, well, he has my face, but it looks better on him than it does on me, which is it's just crazy thinking. And a therapist pointed out to me one day, he said, so you're saying ugly looks better on him than it does on you? No. But I didn't think about it in that way. I just thought, okay, he looks better. My face looks better on him. And I also avoided mirrors. I still don't like mirrors, and I don't know of too many people that do. And I don't like cameras. It is much harder. I can stand in front of an audience and I can sing, but it is much harder for me to face myself in a camera. I'm sure you've heard of the saying, if you can't love yourself, you can't love anybody else. And I strongly disagree with that. I think it comes from a very narcissistic viewpoint, because to me what that says is that if no one else loved you, if your parents didn't love you when they should have, why should you love yourself? And if your parents didn't love you the way that they should have loved you, and the people closest to you, how would you know how to love yourself? How would you be able to even begin to grasp the concept of self-love? I believe that self-love is ingrained in us before we even realize it. I believe that self-love presents itself in self-preservation. It's a survival skill. When you go through hard times, you're going to do what it takes to survive. That is self-love. And you don't even realize it. You don't even think about it at the time. And to me, self-love is not about standing in the mirror and looking at yourself and saying, hey, I love you. I mean, who does that? I don't. Self-love is about doing the work in healing. And if you were never loved in the right way, you don't know how to accept yourself. When someone says you can't love anybody if you can't love yourself, to me it's a very condescending statement. Because there were plenty of people that loved me when I did not love myself. And if that statement were true, Ruth Davis, Miss Neal, Miss Preston, Mrs. Hampton, they never would have loved me in the way that I needed to be loved as a child. including Helene Thigpen and Virginia Atkinson. I don't really think about, oh, I love myself today. But I accept the reality of which I came from. I accept and understand what I went through. And I understand that my parents were very sick. And the way that my parents died was very telling, considering the way that they lived their life, because they died alone. And I had enough self-preservation and self-love, even though I didn't know that's what it was at the time, to make the decision to sever ties with them. I severed ties with my father before he passed away. And I had enough love for my own child to do that. And I had enough self-preservation and concern for myself and my well-being to say this relationship with my father does not work, and it is not safe, and it is harmful to me. And if it's harmful to me, it's harmful to my son. I haven't always made the best decisions. Because there was a time, and I haven't gotten to that, where I did go through a time of promiscuity. And during that time, what I really needed was somebody to just shake me and say, what the hell are you doing to yourself? And I just didn't think things through. I went from one relationship to the other. And when you go through trauma, it doesn't occur to you to process decisions that you make. I think as you heal and as you do the work that you need to recover from the damage of abuse, you begin to love yourself more. And as you do that, you begin to attract more people that are more like-minded. You begin to attract people who treat you better. I found the husband that I have today because of the work that I did. Because I took responsibility of how I had been affected by the abuse. I took responsibility of poor decisions, of turning to men for comfort, and learning how to have boundaries, and learning what I wanted out of life and how I did not want to be treated. And the reason why I say this is because I did not learn that from my parents. The only thing I learned from my parents was how not to treat people. When I was in the 6th and 7th grade, my parents had started attending classes again to go through adoption proceedings to adopt more children, which is the last thing they needed to do. And that is another story that took me decades to process and really begin to understand what took place. My parents, my 7th grade year, we began to prepare for a move to a small town near Texarkana in Nash, Texas. During that time, my parents began proceedings to take in 3 girls from a foster home that were sisters. 2 had the same father and mother, and one they all shared a mother, and 2 of them had the same father, and the older sister did not. Their names were April Dawn Strong, Tiffany Ann Bright, and Rose Marie Wright. April was 8 years old at the time. Tiffany was 5 years old at the time, and Rose was 4. Rose had the most potential with development and doing well in school. April and Tiffany had already been through horrific abuse, and as infants and toddlers, they had been given alcohol in their bottles. And my parents should not have taken them in. I was only 13 or 14 at the time. And Tiffany had the potential to be very violent at times, the 5-year-old. So violent that my parents would have to hold her down at night at bedtime. April would have episodes where she would just stare into space. And Rose was just powering through as a 4-year-old through all of that chaos. Tiffany would act out and would say inappropriate things and make derogatory comments. Tiffany would ask my father if she could see his genitals, and I had found this out later after this happened. This is what my mother stated, and I'm going to tell you what I think really happened. My father made the statement one time because he was not equipped to handle Tiffany's behavioral acting out, and he made the statement in front of the girls, "Let's just send them back to the foster home." I was devastated over this. I will always regret that because I regret the pain that April, Tiffany, and Rose were caused by my parents. And my father convinced my mother to send all 3 of them back to foster care before the adoption was final. I did witness my father put his hand on their bottoms. And this is just like I was explaining how my father was able to get away with touching children inappropriately right in front of you, and it bothered me, and I didn't understand why. I would witness my father touch them in the exact same way that he would touch me when I was younger, and it bothered me. And I couldn't explain why, because I was a teenager. And I think that the reason why my father convinced my mother to send April, Tiffany, and Rose back to foster care was because one of them was beginning to talk because he sexually abused them. And my parents could not afford for their dirty secret to get out. And this was when he was a pastor of First United Methodist Church in Nash, Texas, which was just outside of Texarkana, Texas. I was attending West Lawn Middle School at the time. During the time that we had moved to Nash, Texas, I went through a depression, a major depression. I couldn't eat. We were at a brand new church, and I would be sitting there in the youth room almost in tears. I just could not keep it together, and I didn't understand why. It was similar to the depression that I had been through when my parents moved to Carlisle. And I broke down in a doctor's appointment one day, and my mother took me. And that day, my mother convinced me that they wanted to keep April, Tiffany, and Rose so that they could get a stipend from the state of Texas. And to this day, I still have a hard time just processing that and wrapping my head around that. But I think, like I said, I think that my father convinced my mother to send April, Tiffany, and Rose back to foster care because one of them was beginning to talk, and my father could not afford for it to get out that he was a sexual predator. And my mother sure as hell didn't want it to get out, and that is why she was in agreement with my father. They were sent back to a foster home in Marshall, Texas. And they came back one last time to visit, to say goodbye. And the girls really did not want to have much to do with my mother. Rose, who was 4, came and sat in my lap. And all I could do was sit there and cry as Rose sat in my lap. I don't really remember much of anything else. I just remember her climbing in my lap, wanting nothing to do with my mother. And I just sat and cried. And I really had no one to turn to during that time. And of course, my mother had to make it all about her and how she was devastated. I was pretty sheltered, so I really have no idea what people from the outside looking in must have thought. And I regret that my parents did that. I wish that I could have done more, but I don't know of what else I could have done. I don't know what happened to the girls after that. I don't know if April, Tiffany, and Rose had been placed for adoption again. And this is for April Dawn Strong, and Tiffany Ann Wright, and Rosemarie Wright. Saying I'm sorry, I don't think is good enough. And I do regret what happened. And I wish that I had had the insight and the maturity that I had needed to address that situation. And I'm sorry that that the home that my parents provided was a disappointment. It was much more than a disappointment, and I am so sorry for that. And that is all I have for this episode.